Yep.
You do
All
tend
right.
to freeze up while the thing.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, I've got high speed, or what Videotron calls high speed, but let me know if I freeze
Well,
up. All right. Um, let's get started. The art of writing for newspapers. Um, the purpose today is um, assuming you've done, as most of you have, you've done some great research, you've done some good interviews, you've had some time in the taxi or the Uber on the way to the interview. You only have a day to write a story. You've already started thinking about how to write it. Maybe you have 2, 3 days. So I'm
not
not going to
a day.
try to show you.
How about 2 3 hours?
No, as I'm saying, sometimes you might have 2, 3 hours, but if you have 2, 3 days, but if you only have 2, 3 hours, you're in the Uber at 10 o'clock, you start blocking it out in your mind
I think
even before your first interview, and you start writing. The purpose today is not to give you as usual, I imagine your heads will explode, but this is not to give you additional tasks. It's to finesse your skill set so that your writing comes faster and cleaner. Um, what we're going to look at is building scenes, not paragraphs, the lead as a flashlight, as a promise, so don't tell, writing for all five senses, how to make turn signals, and finally how to organize your writing. Now, just to recap, remember what we already discussed last week. And Bonnie, you could download the slideshows on my website. But I'm assuming you've already done, as Marie maybe has, rewritten her stories. A lot of you had good characters, the radio shop owner, the man who lost his wife, the man who lost, his toes and other parts of his body in the cold. Your character has to go on a journey, right? You need to have your character on a journey, even in a quick news story, which means no matter where you start, you might tease the opening, but you have to ask questions so we know what, that sex worker, before she became a dominatrix, what was she before? You have to have good structure, you have to have focus. Remember as well what we talked about. Characters are key. Um, a good way to think about this, and we didn't explicitly talk about this last week, is what I call the 5 C's. I make a list when I'm doing a story, and especially when I'm doing an interview. Do I have the 5 C's? The 5 C's are a character. You need a protagonist. You need context, right? I need to know, you know, how big an industry is the sex industry. I need to know the record store guy, how long has he had the store? What's the competition with the streamers? Conflict is the guts of your story. Why should I care? Right? The man who lost his wife is fighting the MUHC, right? The climax, your story somewhere close to the end has to reach a dramatic climax, regardless of what you put in the lead. And then the conclusion, often what happens next? The battle is going to continue. Remember the potato farmer or explorer, right? What's his next plan? So you need these 5 C's. And as we discussed, this is roughly what any good story is like. You start with your character, you meet your character, um, you then do context. Bonnie's story about the battle at MRC, like most stories, is mainly about conflict, some kind of resolution, what happened at the MRC, who won, who lost, and then some kind of conclusion, what's happening next. You could play with this a bit, but every story from the Bible to Star Wars to any good 5 paragraph news story in the suburban pretty much should follow this structure. Now, once you have the characters, once you've plotted out the structure, let's look at some ways you can engage in good writing. And one of the most important things I think is I come from TV, but obviously I started in print and I still write books and I still write for the Gazette and the Star and the Globe. I write features. Is I think it's much better, instead of when you're sitting down with your editor and you're saying, yeah, I'm looking at my opening lead and I'm looking at my third paragraph. That's fine. but you're using writing words that your readers never, I've never met a reader who said, wow, did you see that great nut graph in the Gazette yesterday? Or anybody who says, wow, that was a great lead in the Suburban. No civilian talks like that. Only you and your editor talk like that. What people talk about is scenes, right? Did you hear that story about? So I want you to think about scenes, which brings me to the lead. Okay. Now, some of you, we're all taught in school that the lead is supposed to give you the five C's, the five W's, right? Who, what, where, when, why, whatever, right? The inverted pyramid came about historically because back in the day when newspaper reporters were filing their story via the telegraph, there was always a fear that the telegraph line would go down. So you had to get the most important information right at the beginning. And also, to some degree, people were rushed. That makes sense if you've got an amazing breaking news story, right? Mayor John Smith resigned abruptly yesterday when a police report revealed he was under investigation for embezzling millions. That's your lead, right? 20 people died, 10 missing when a five alarm destroyed a senior's home. I get that. But most of the stories you submitted for this class, most of the stories you write, even your news stories, are not earth shattering news that you have to write it in a kind of boring AP style. Remember the MUHC story, right? A woman died, but she'd already been dead quite a while. And the lead didn't just say, a woman who died is now suing the MUHC. That's fine. That's classic lead style. But I'm trying to suggest in many cases, you should kill the inverted pyramid. I love this quote from a British writer. Try to assimilate this. Instead of always worried about whether you have who, what, where, and why, think of your lead, I love these words, as a flashlight, a promise. Don't worry about the five W's. You've got plenty of paragraphs, even if your story is 6 paragraphs long, to get in the five W's. What you want is a flashlight, a promise. Why should I take the 2 minutes or the 5 minutes to read your story? Um, Now, obviously, I write books, so I have a little more time. But here's an example of how I started my second book on the Hells Angels. They had not planned on beheading her, right? Now, right away, you go, beheading who? And what do you mean they hadn't planned on it, right? So you're going to want to read the story of Cynthia Garcia. I could have said, the Hells Angels are well known as a murderous gang, and this book will explore, I could have said 600 people have been killed by the Hells Angels in their rampage in the last few years, right? Or I could have said Cynthia Garcia was murdered for just going to a Hells Angels clubhouse. But you want a promise, a flashlight. This is what I wrote when I did a book on child sex predators, right? The cage was not big, even if it had been for a dog. For a small 6-year-old, it was cramped. Right away, I hope the reader's going to want to, who's in this cage? Why is she in the cage? And then you'll find out. So let's take a look at some of your leads, right? And let's look, did your first sentence, right? That's your, you only have one chance to grab the reader. We have the headline. By the way, that's the other thing. The headline is your friend. The headline could give away some of the five W's, right? But your lead has to be great writing. Was there a promise, a flashlight? So remember Marie's lead, right? Whatever you do, don't get pregnant, right? Well, most people, I think, are at least going to go to the second sentence, right? Did Marie get pregnant, right? What happened, right? That's a promise. That's a flashlight. Right away, I know the story is going to be about pregnancy, but I'm intrigued, right? Remember Dan's story? You can't read it. I'm just going to try to move this away. There we go, right? Um, what began as a simple routine surgery ended with the death of a 33-year-old woman, right? He doesn't say they're now suing a multi-million dollar suit. He's got time in the second or third paragraph, right? He takes me into the story, right? Now, it could have been maybe tweaked. You could have said, I forget his name, but let's say his husband, you could have said, you know, when Henry walked in to see his 33-year-old wife, right, he never knew it would be the last day or something. You could have increased the tension a bit, but the idea is still right. Um, Now, remember India. I don't think India is here today. She did a long story on sex workers, right? As specifically dominatrix. So Mistress Avery greets us in a silk robe at the entrance of her dungeon with a hug and later cups of mint tea. This is the feature. She has time, right? But she doesn't right away. I want to know dungeon, silk robe, right? I'm intrigued, right? It's a flashlight, not a promise. And same thing with KC's story. We meet Michael Amouth. He unfurls a newspaper and he has a bunch of potatoes. That's a WTF moment, right? I'm going, potatoes. Why does he have potatoes? So those are some examples. Um, I don't think is Patrick here? No, I don't think Patrick is here. Um, let's get some feedback. Now let's look at how some leads could have been improved. Remember this story? Johnny Cooper, as you could see, had his second toe amputated. He's fighting the forestry company. So how does this lead work? It's not straight news. How could it be improved? Get some feedback. I hope it's big enough for all of
Patrick
you to
is
read.
here.
Oh,
Patrick
hey,
is here,
Patrick.
actually.
Yeah, I'm here now. Yeah.
Okay,
Hi.
hey Patrick. So remember, this was a great story. It was a journey. We got to meet Johnny. We were on his trip, right? We recounted the cold and what happened. Then we talk about the lawsuit and we get into the complicated politics. We have all the five W's later on. As a lead, what are some of the strong points and how could Patrick have improved it? Don't be shy. We can all be openly suggestive of each other.
So what comes to mind for me, Marie, is that the toe got amputated. And I think that's a very visceral response. So a sentence that suggests either that the forestry company yet again cut off his toe, something along those lines that pits the good and evil together.
That could work. I think we all agree. Second toe amputated, you got me, right? It's not even the first toe, right? Right. So that's good. How else? Um, you, I think
Following,
this is, yeah,
following classic lines, following everything you've said, it's good. It's good lead. But if you want to grab the reader on a personal basis, Johnny Cooper never really trusted the people he worked for.
that could work. That could work. Again, promise and flashlight, right? You get a sense
Especially
of
after they cut off his second toe.
That's what I was gonna
No,
like, you could even do comma and you say, especially after he lost his second toe. I think the other point I think we agree is this part. Oh, sorry. The part he's going to the media in hopes of finally receiving justice, robbing his livelihood. And, you know, I think this is what I call, to some degree, it's wasted real estate, right? Because he's going to the media. Well, obviously, there's a story here, right? So we don't need to say that. And I'm always um, leery of words. Like the word I hate the most in journalism is stakeholders, unless you're doing a restaurant review of waiters, right? So anytime you have a story that says stakeholders, justice, livelihood in your lead, right? That's a great speech by Mark Carney, maybe, but it's not storytelling, right? So you might
oh,
say,
but it's been used so often in the public, unfortunately, that younger writers tend to think that that's normal. It's
yes,
like
but
what
if,
I had a
as I
writer
like to
once.
say, though, yeah. But I like to say avoid cliches like the plague, otherwise you risk spinning your wheels,
I had a
right?
writer once who insisted in almost everything to stick in the word reveal.
Reveal, that's
I
right.
just
When it's not a reveal. That's right. So,
doesn't matter.
like here,
Story.
like you could say instead of, you could say,
And she used the noun, the reveal, right? It wasn't
yeah.
that this was
But you
Totally.
could say we instead of just receive it, you could sort of say, Johnny Cooper is so angry as having his second toe amputated, he feels he has no other choice but to speak out. Okay, now I
Mm.
want to know, how did he lose his toe? And I know he's speaking out. I know this is a conflict. So a good lead, good idea, but go with something stronger, right? Second toe
Mm.
amputated is much better than receiving justice. Um, uh, This isn't, let's look at remember Joel's story about the music store owner, right? Alliteration and there's a standard rule of the rule of three, right? If you say something, say it three times, three beats. And Joel does that. He actually goes four or five times, loves music, loves playing music, loves listening. He loves buying rare records, right? So that's good, right? It's getting there. What else could Joel have done to just maybe um, tweak it a bit? Joel, any thoughts on your own?
Uh, Not that I can think of offhand.
I mean, I don't. I mean, I think it works. We'll talk later about place and sense, because I'm not sure you need December 1988, 988, where it is, right? That's clutter information that's context. Put that in the second or third paragraph, right? So you might be able to say he loves buying records. That's why you know, he's surrounded by a veritable museum of or well, that's why his store is cluttered, in a mountain of, right, drag me in rather than giving me, because this is classic when and where, right? I don't need when and where in a lead, I would argue, right? um
I would
uh
love to know when he first started to love music or how he first started to love
I
music.
agree. That could work, since he was a kid, or Nick Catalano remembers the first time he touched
Yeah.
a vinyl record, right? It was a Led Zeppelin. Now whatever. But if you say, I agree, you do a journey and you capture it. So a good lead, these are good
Again,
leads,
part of what
but you could
Julian,
tweak them.
I think part of what Julian is trying to get across, and we've all discussed this, we can't always do it. And sometimes Michael moves the paragraphs around, but Julian, quite rightly, is a big fan of personalizing the story. So,
Yeah,
for example, Nick Catalano always loved to do things himself. Nick
yeah,
Catalano always loved to be his own boss. Then you
yeah.
get into the
You
because
find out what's that's
we
right.
talk about the fact that he was an independent working against big firms, big
Big firm.
companies.
That's right. That's right. Let's take a look. This is Bonnie's story. It's a new one this week, so I hope you read it. It's a long story, and I'll show you the whole length. Complicated story about the MRC. Bonnie, this was a daily story, I imagine, right? You covered the meeting, and then you had a few hours to write it.
I honestly don't remember. That was a while ago, but I probably had at least a day or two, depending on the
Okay,
date.
all right. So it was quite a meeting, as you read the story. A huge mutiny, lots of yelling. So this is her lead. Whoops, sorry. The MRC Pontiac's Council of Mayors held a special meeting April 29th at the MRC headquarters in Litchfield with one item on the agenda, a newsletter concerning the Energy from Waste Initial Business Plan, IBP, and to set aside $3,000 from the warden's travel budget to cover its printing and distribution. Second graph, it was standing room only with two police cruisers parked across the street. All right. So that's a classic. It's got at least three or four of the five W's, right? I get the information. It's got all the information. How does it work as a flashlight, as a promise, as something that's going to drag me in? Comments,
Well,
even starting.
I can already see it's like normally it's not very interesting. And I know I can already see what I could have done differently, like based on what we've talked about. Further down, I went on to say that the next paragraph or something is the meeting was filled with tension from the start.
That's
So
right.
a better lead would have probably been like to start with that. The meeting was filled with tension from the start with two police cruisers parked across the street. would have been a
I
stronger
certainly
lead.
this like when I read it, two police cruisers parked like absolutely right. So if your lead had been
It's a
there were
great story.
two police cruisers were parked across the street, and the tensions kept rising. In a heated debate over budget at last night's count. Then whoa, what
But I had to handle. It's a great story, but I had to handle the same kind of edit. Chelsea wrote a story on. We had the same thing happen, not at MRC, but at Point Claire City Council meeting over pro-growth, anti-growth, and she started the story very much like you did, and I just added one sentence at the beginning. Point Claire City Council exploded last week as 9 councillors walked out screaming at the mayor. Then we got into the facts, and there was a whole series of stories leading finally to the council asking Quebec to intervene to make Point
yeah.
Claire workable. But that tension that Julien's getting at, I think,
That's right.
you
You
throw the
want that
tension.
tension. And we'll talk later about an eye for detail. But two police cruisers parked across is a good example of showing, not telling. You don't have to say tensions rose, because if there are police cruisers, I know there's tension, right? So again, another example of how to improve your writing. Um, Chelsea isn't here. Um, you remember she wrote a very good story about this Laval homeowner. Chad is a fictitious name. Um, and it's about real estate scams, right? Now, her lead was, I don't know who the actual culprit is, but that does not change my situation. So I think the problem I have with that, it starts off well. I don't know who the actual culprit is, right? That's a Agatha Christie opening, but it does not change my situation. Well, I don't know what his situation is. I'm confused. Remember, we said start him on a journey, right? Um, Chad had high hopes when the well-dressed couple walked into his offered, to buy his home, but it didn't take long for it to all come crashing down. Something like that, right? And then we said the second graph could describe the couple. They walk in, there's a deed, and then the third and fourth graph, I'm off and running with the conflict, right? Um, so like this is just a slow start. Find potential buyers. I don't know what the conflict is. I'm not grabbed. Right.
Absolutely
Um,
right. And you're absolutely right, Julian. And now I feel bad because that's on me. But when you're editing 40, 50 stories a week,
of course. No,
it
no,
should
no.
have
I
been
mean, no, the point about the advantage of this is hindsight. This is hindsight. Although I'm glad I recorded this because now I have Beryl saying you're absolutely right, Julian. So this is good.
a lot of things you're saying. I said to the staff for years. So I agree with everything you're saying. And some
Yeah, no,
the
I'm
editor,
joking. Is Natalia here?
Natalia, was here.
Natalia, you there? I don't have all
Yes,
my.
I'm here.
Hey,
I'm
hi,
here.
Natalia.
Hi.
Actually,
Hi.
Natalia, you're one of the new people. You want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Uh, yeah, I'm writing for the Nation magazine with Patrick Quinn. Yeah.
Okay. So Natalia wasn't here last week. I hope you read her story.
I was
Uh,
I was last
oh, were
week
you?
because I was a bit late. Yeah, yeah. I
Okay,
remember.
sorry, I missed you at the beginning.
Hey,
Okay, so
Julian,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt on a personal note, I've got to ask Natalia, but your accent, where are you from?
Ukraine.
Я родился в Харкове.
oh,
Oh,
very
really?
By,
impressive.
I'm from Kiev.
by accident of history, my parents were traveling.
Well, so you speak Ukrainian as well?
No, speak Russian.
Russia,
Oh,
that part of
me
Now,
too.
Ukraine,
now you
Me too as
which
well.
may be a permanent
It's
part of
fine.
Russia. All right, let's move on. So,
calm down, Julian.
Natalia has a long classic news story about toxic concerns at a river. This is her lead. The failure of a toxicity test at the Chalk River nuclear facility near Ottawa is raising concerns about environmental damage and poor communication with Indigenous communities. Pretty classic lead, right? Totally clear. I get what it's about. I've got at least two if not three of the five W's, right? So it works. How could we make this better based on what
Well,
we're
what I'm
discussing?
thinking, yeah, regarding the thing that you just talked, what I'm missing, I feel not telling but showing. Maybe I would start with the river
Yes.
about to describe the environmental
Yeah,
thing.
I exactly. I was gonna, and we'll talk about this later on when we look at the five senses. But this is a story about a river, and if you read the story, I never meet the river. I'm never at the river. All I am
I
is on websites.
the other
There's
way.
no river.
Julian, I'm going to go the other way for a second. There's no particular. I think it's a great lead because this is hard news. It's not about. There's no person involved. There's a river. You want to make the river a person, fine. But and this is excuse me.
Yeah, but let me just interrupt, Beryl. And yes, look, as we said at the beginning, writing is an art, it's not a science. There's no right answer, right? I have my views, people have. It works perfectly well. Remember what I said about your headline is your friend? The headline already tells me what I need to know. There are concerns, there's a toxic spill, it's disposable, it's near the Ottawa River, right? Again, for me, this is what I call stakeholder language, environmental damage, poor communication. Sure, but those words just wash over me, right? If you, I forget the woman's name, but you've got sorry, we've got one of the leading, environmental people, right? If you say whatever her name is,
Larissa
Mary,
Hoffman.
Mary Smith, yeah, Mary Smith, is knee deep on the banks of the Ottawa River, and she's worried about what she's finding, something like that. Or if you want a
Julian,
harder lead, or if you want a harder lead, give me instead of the failure of toxicity, say what does that mean, right? Fears of cancer and you know, um, are sweeping through or something like that, right? This
uh,
lead tells
yeah,
me exactly what's in the headline. Doesn't
Julian,
advance the story. Yep.
you're. I if I was editing it, I wouldn't change the lead. I changed, as you said, the headline's your friend. So, toxic spill from disposal facility near Ottawa River raises spikes health dangers. Put in health, put in danger in the lead.
Could
Forget about
could be.
concern.
Could be. No, no. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with this lead. It's clear, it's accurate. I just think you could make it more powerful with better storytelling. I don't think Tashi is here. Tashi, you here? Um, this was a story about uh, and this I think this lead suffers from not being newsy, so I don't know why I should care, and not being storytelling, right? Um, you know, I I've just got a bunch of the minute, by the way, if you ever have,
Bill,
initials in your story, you're in trouble. And if you tell me Grand Orchestre and Grand Riviere Secondary School, you've lost me already, right? But she's not here. I don't want to. Devin, is Devin here this week? Um, don't think so. Um,
Julian, if I can interrupt for a
yep.
second, I don't mind if you get into Tashi's stuff because she works for me. So
Okay.
it's really helpful for me as her editor to
Okay.
hear the feedback
Well,
if you
what
do
what
that
we mainly
time.
said about Denise, this story had to be rewritten because it was wrong, right? She wasn't resigning from the orchestra just as a teacher. And we'll look later at the lack of sound in the story. But this is a story of to say somebody is a pillar of a musical community is a classic example of telling rather than showing, right? You're telling me that. Um, but if you said, um, if she's playing her last note, right, and she puts down her violin, right, or she remembers the students she inspired, and just something about this woman. I just know nothing. I just know she's a member of an alphabet soup, right? She's like with the Gogr and then Grand Riviere, right? Maybe just say, when you've been teaching students for 35 years the love of music, it's hard to say goodbye. Okay, now I've got it. Now, her name's not, it's not Trump, it's not the Defense Department. Her name, the official things are not that important, right? What's important is a woman leaving her dreams behind, right? That's what the story is about. This is a classic example. A lot of stories start with just the facts, right? So Dr. Das Linkletter, known as Relentless Indigenous Online, is an Inuit Cree and proud member of the Moose Creative Territory, right? Whoops, sorry. Right? So that's just, there's no news there, right? That's like saying, the third tree in the forest is a maple tree. Okay, but there's no influential, nothing's happening here, right? So even in a portrait, remember Joel's story? Joel's story also is a static story about a record store owner, but he puts action in right away because he tells me about the store owner's historical love of music and that he's going to take on the companies. I don't know why I should, this looks like an obit or something, right? Like, I don't know anything about this person. You haven't grabbed me. All right. Opening structure. Once you've played with your lead, and again, your lead, I start working on the lead the minute I get assigned the story. Even before I've done my interviews, I start thinking, how could I make this work, right? Because the lead is what sells your story. And again, think of it as an opening scene. Some of you may know Don Gilmore. It's an excellent news writer, magazine writer, used to write a lot for The Walrus and the old Saturday Night. Back in the days when I was in TV, he had written a fabulous portrait of Jacques Parizeau for Saturday Night. And I'm dating myself. Jacques Parizeau was a PQ leader, for those of you who don't know him. And Saturday Night was a magazine that used to exist in Canada. And I saw him at a party, and I said, "Love your story on Jacques Parizeau." And he said, I remember this to this day. He said, "Yeah, I really struggled with the opening scene." And I said, "Pardon me? What did you just say?" And he said, "I was really struggling with the opening scene." And I said, "Don, most of my friends work in newspapers. I've worked in newspapers. I have never heard a print reporter say opening scene. That's what we say when we do TV. I'm suggesting that all of you should use the word opening scene, not lead. Again, no civilian on the planet, no person on the planet except you and your editor use the word lead. It does not exist in the world. It is a creation of newspapers, right? Opening scene. So your question, Bonnie, to any of your staff and Natalia and Dan and Joel, when you're thinking of your writing, is as you're sitting in the Uber coming back from the interview, not what is my lead, what's my opening scene? It's record man ripping off the vinyl of a new or an old Led Zeppelin, right? It's husband hearing that fateful beep beep of the monitor, right? It's, environmental woman wading through the river, right? What is your opening scene, not your lead scene? Then usually you have a quote or a detail that builds the tension, right? So if your opening scene is just the woman in the river, the second thing is cancer and dangers or something like that. And then the third or fourth graph usually is where you put your nut graph, right? Where you summarize. So if the person only reads the first 4 or 5 graphs, they've pretty much got the story, right? So this grabs me, this gives me a bit of context, and this tells me why I should care, right? And that's you could change it a bit, but usually I find that's the best way. And then the rest of the story, of course, is chronological. So nut graphs. Nut graphs is the summary of your story. And for those of you who took the course last week, it's the focus, right? Right? It's the da 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 because da 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 da. Something happened that forced this person to do this. His wife died. He's now suing because of a cover-up, right? Record store owner, aside from all his love, is doing this because he's fighting the streaming giants, right? The nut graph tells me the basic conflict, right? So if you look at any of the Super Bowl coverage, right, the lead obviously is who won, but the nut graph is that the Eagles toppled, the reigning kings, by outplaying them and having a stronger offense. That's the nut graph. It gives me the broader picture. Tells me what the story is about, tells me why I should care. It's the focus of your story. So let's take a look at some of your nut graphs, if they're there, um, and um, and look at at how we could in improve them. Um, KC in his story about potatoes kind of has the nut graph here, right? Now he is trying to revive a crop of these traditional tubers for future generations to enjoy, right? It kicks off the rest of the story. Why is he doing it? Now, nut graphs are especially important in Bonnie's story, where you have a real, in Dan's story about the woman who died, it's a pretty linear story. Woman dies, standard procedure, husband grieves, finds out there's a cover up, he sues, right? So it's not a hard story to understand, right? Same with Joel's record story, right? Even the pollution story to some degree, right? Tree huggers say river is polluted, company says it's not. I get it. But a story like this, right? Where you've got, I mean, I just went back, you've got Lake Councillor Jennifer Quayle, and then you've got Toller and Mayor LaFleur and Myers. You've got a lot of players. I don't quite, it's over a budget plan. I don't quite know, you really need a strong nut graph to guide me through this, right? You need to say something like, Bonnie, I know tensions, I know they're police. Then you're going to mention but what is the basic debate, right? You know, most counselors were furious that the plan was pushed aside without a fair hearing, or I have no idea, right? But I'm reading, this is like watching a rugby match and you don't understand how the game is played, right? So you really need a nut graph right about here that tells me, because I don't know what the IBP is, and what is the fight over? Corruption, a lack of hearing, they're against the waste, I have no idea, right? You really need a nut graph. Really, really important.
Gotcha.
And it's up to you to make sense when maybe for most people at the meeting, there wasn't a lot of sense because there could have been all kinds of agendas, right? But look at any good New York Times stories these days. Look at the Trump stuff going on, which is like insane to follow, right? It's just scattershot. So they'll give you the news. Trump now announced this, then he did, and then in the third or fourth graph, they say it's part of a continuing series of attacks on the federal, it just tells me where the story is about. Natalia's story, right? Um, Same thing. Um, I would say again, I get really you've got CNSCC, NSDF, CNL, uh, the proposed NDF sewage effluent. This is really hard for me to absorb, right? And imagine if you were reading this on radio or something, right? So somebody was reading this and then say, "Hey, did you read Natalia's story about the CNSSC and the CNL and the sewage effluent?" No human being would talk like that, right? I need a nut graph here that says environmentalists say, cancer and so, could start, or there could be high rates of, unless the CNL cleans up its act, but the company insists everything is fine or something, right? I just need a graph right here that gives me the guts of the story. This is really important, folks. Great lead, but about 3 or 4 paragraphs down, crystallize your story in 10 words, 15 words in English, no initials, and no stakeholders unless you're reviewing waiters. Right, that's a long story. Here, Beryl had this was a column, of course. You remember Beryl's long column on the great investigation, which won awards about the protocol. And we'll if you look at
That wasn't a,
because it,
that was a front page story. It was from a
yeah,
link from the.
right, that's right. And it goes through the history of, and if you go through it, it talks about the first myth, the second myth, the third myth, right? So this was great reporting by the newspaper, it's quite shocking and stuff like that. Um, uh, my only and again, you have to assume most of your readers have probably been reading it, so they're following the story, right? They know it to some degree. My only brief suggestion is I would have moved something like this notion. Like I still don't know entirely why I should, So I would like I'm still here, editorial started applicable, dire, I still don't quite know what the main issue is, right? Um, so
Uh, I should have sent the first part of the story. This is a three-part story.
right.
So the first part, but to one of your favorite points. So the first paragraph of the story sets out Quebec is enacting a protocol forcing on hospitals to pull ER and ICU assistance from anybody over 60 in case of a surge.
Yeah, no,
That
it
was
was
the
shocking. I mean,
that was that
yeah,
was the story was in the first part story. But you like, and I like color commentary too. It was the whole series was going to start with, I think it would be one of your favorite scenes. The corridors of the National Assembly were very cold that night, and you could hear your feet clack on the terrazzo floors as I was making my way to the office of a very courageous bureaucrat. Because that's the way we got the leak. I got the
that's
leak.
great.
Except
That's great. I agree.
he begged me. Don't say where you got it. Don't say where you were. Don't
Right. Just
mention.
give me the all I'm saying is that aside from as you're saying, the stronger lead and a sense of context, something like this, right? Quebec bureaucrats are getting ready to pull the plug on anybody over 70, even though doctors and legal experts say it is unnecessary and unethical. I need something like that higher up so I get the context. All right, let's move on. We've done leads. We've done the nut graph. Now let's look at the rest of your paragraphs or your scenes. In fact, all of them. And let's talk about showing, not telling. Um, this is surprising even when I train TV people. TV people, of course, are showing, but what's remarkable is how bad some of the filming is. So they're actually not, they're saying, Joe Smith is angry that there's no snow removal, and you just see Joe Smith walking. I don't see him angry. You don't have to tell me he's angry if I could see it, right? So TV people still do a remarkable poor job of showing rather than telling, especially in their writing. But your challenge is much harder, right? You're living in a world where most people are watching YouTube and TikTok. Many of your stories, they're already, even city council, they could watch it live on camera, um, cell phone news, right? And you are writing boring two-dimensional black and white print, or it's on the website, right? But it's still two-dimensional. Some of you are incorporating video, but you have a challenge. But that's not bad. I mean, I spend all my life now writing books. So I've got to figure out on each page how to show, not tell. And it means, you've got to look for that little detail that shows and doesn't tell. The little detail is amazing. So remember Oprah's speech, which was a great example of beginning, middle, and end, right? Remember, she's talking about I was a little girl sitting. Now, in that speech she made at the Golden Globe, she never says I was a poor girl, right? A boring speechwriter would have said, I was a poor girl growing up in Alabama, and when I saw Sidney Poitier as a famous black actor, I realized I too could be a star. That would be the way any normal human being would say it, but not Oprah, right? Linoleum floor. You know, I was a kid watching from the cheap seats as my mom came home bone tired cleaning other people's houses. In 4 words, linoleum floor, cheap seats, bone tired, cleaning other people's houses, I know where Oprah came from. She made me feel it. She never said I was poor. She never uses the word poor. She never tells me. She shows me, right? That's your model. Be Oprah every time you're writing, right? Show me, don't tell me. Um, let's use this example. Um, you, Bonnie and Beryl, who are editors, and those of you who have a chance to rewrite your stories. Um, so imagine, like the MRC story. But imagine you're writing a story, and your second line or something, or even your lead, but somewhere in your story you say the citizens at city council meetings were outraged that the mayor refused to back down on tax hikes. Perfectly good sentence, very clear. Um, uh, how could you improve it, either by changing that sentence or having a different line before or after? Because you're telling me they were outraged, right? So some suggestions. How would you rewrite those? This is what you've written in the Uber on your phone as but you've come back to the office. You have half an hour to rewrite your story. You look at this sentence, you go, okay, I could make that better.
Well, the way we do it, and particularly Joel is excellent at this. He always does this. He personalizes it. He'll tell you longtime city council attendee John Smith said, and others, and then he quotes him, and then and other
Okay,
citizens
so
that
that
meeting were
helps.
all out. He
That
personalized.
helps because you personalize it and you get a quote. How else, though, could you show? A quote will help, but how else? What could you describe to me that would show me outrage? What's the linoleum floor here? Right, right. When Oprah says
Crossed
linoleum
arms and
floor,
scowls.
pardon me.
Again, example.
Crossed arms and scowls.
That would help. Absolutely. Crossed arms and scowls. There could be, you look for what if people, like Beryl's idea of personalizing it, right? So, whatever, longtime counselor, ripped up the agenda and stormed out of the hall, or something, somebody in the back, they were muttering or they, whatever. You could show me outrage.
Again, I got to give you an example from a Joel story. Um, I'm thinking of changing the name of the guy because you'll know the name of the guy. Harold Brown turned. I got to change the name of the woman. Harold Harold Brown. Harold Brown turned to Sheila Black and barked. It's all about you, isn't it? And
That's
then he
perfect,
went.
right? That I agree. That I know there's outrage, there's personal
Harold Brown was
venom,
a lawyer, by the
right?
way.
Then you could say, this is okay, citizens were out. That's okay as your second or line after that. But show me outrage. Here's a harder example. I mean, again, and let's for the moment say you're not going to quote little Jessica. Because Jessica saying something is the same as you telling it, right? So Jessica was so happy when she learned that the school bus route would be changed to uh, pick her up every day, no more long walks. Now she could say that. I'm so happy. That's a little better, but not much, because she's telling me rather than you telling me.
So would
How
you start off the story talking about how happy she is, or would you start off the story describing her usual boring long walks, or like,
Well, but
dragging
I
her,
agree. No, but
knapsack?
that goes to lead and what we said, the journey, literally in this case, her journey to school. But now I'm
Okay.
saying is regardless of your better lead, you've got this sentence in your story. She's happy now. So even if your better lead was Jessica remembers the cold winter days of slogging to school in a winter storm with no bus. You're right. And then you could build, but now you do have this, you have her happy. How could you show me she's happy instead of
So to
telling me?
show, I would say you could say something like, little Jessica gleefully bounded up the steps of the school bus, um,
Was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, she could
something to
she
that
could
effect.
do that. She could do that. That would be a good scene. What if we backed it up a bit? Because if she's on the school bus, she's kind of already her journey is literally over, right? She's going to get on that school bus, right? So can we back it up a bit? What else would she have been doing before the bus arrives?
Drank down the milk from her cereal bowl when she heard the bus pull up in front of the house.
That could work. The other thing I was thinking is kind of packing and unpacking. She's gazing out the window. She keeps pulling she keeps looking for the bus the first time it's coming. There are many ways of doing it. What I'm trying to get into your heads is if you're been assigned by your editor to go interview little Jessica, and you pretty much know how you're going to write the story, you're looking for that scene. You can't fake it. You can't say, Jessica, could you stand at the window and gaze out? But she'll do it for you, right? She'll be looking at the clock. She'll be saying, Mommy, when is the bus coming? Right? She'll be putting on her boots, a half hour before the bus arrives. There's all kinds of
Shifting foot to foot, standing at
That's
the
right.
stop, shifting foot to foot, dancing
Exactly.
back and forth.
So again, what I'm trying to get, if you're already thinking scene, not lead, you're thinking character on a journey, and you're thinking show, not tell, right? Right. So, you don't want to have words where you saying we're outraged, we're happy. You want to show me, right? Again, think Oprah. Oprah never told you she was poor. All right. Oh, we're doing well here. Um, Writing for five senses. Now, if you're trying to show rather than tell, um, the five senses are your friend. Now, again, keep in mind, you are dealing, unlike TV, which has visuals and sound, and TikTok these days, right? Think about it. Why is TikTok killing newspapers, right? Um, because
People
first of all, if you right, short, but also if you look at TikTok, it's all about character, it's all about journey, it's all about storytelling. I'm talking
are
about
all
the
about self
news. Yeah,
prepubescent idiot.
no, but I'm not talking about I'm talking about if you look at the good news stories, right? From, war zones, Ukraine, right? The TikTok, they work because everything we've been talking about, character on a journey, conflict, they tell me a story, but they're also visual, so I can usually see it, I could hear it. Radio, good radio has great sound. You don't have that tool. Again, you are dealing with, Gutenberg. When was Gutenberg? 15, you're dealing with some
I don't want
you're
to
dealing
belabor
with something that's 5 centuries old, right?
Julian.
Like,
I don't want to belabor the point, but citizen journalism and social media has opened up incredible things, and we saw it at the Here Square in Cairo and everywhere else. But I've seen very little on TikTok that is anything newsy. If that kind of stories you're talking about, you see on Twitter, but not on TikTok. I
yeah,
mean,
no,
it's
no, but
90.
no, I get your point. But I'm trying to no, but I've seen, like, if you're, I'm not talking about news. I'm not suggesting you switch to TikTok. But if you look at storytelling, the advantage TikTok or Instagram has is they have something you don't have. You are dealing literally with black and white letters on a page, right? And
Right. But
you
it's
somehow have to you get the five senses. You've got to, get me taste, hearing, sight, smell, and touch. And if you look at any great writing, right, great restaurant reviews, they show me even without pictures, right? They show me the plates. I hear the buzz in the restaurant. Obviously, I taste the food. I smell the food. I touch it, right? That's a restaurant review, right? A good hockey story, you know, there's not going to be much taste. There'll be a lot of hearing, right? They'll describe the power of the body check. There'll be a lot of sight, obviously, right? They're describing the winning goal, and touch, right? The crunch of the goalpost. You need all those things. So in your straight news story, Joel's going into a record store, pretty much not going to taste much, probably not going to smell, although there might be some smell, but he's got to say, okay, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? And especially, what am I touching? So again, when I head out into that Uber to do a story, especially if I only have 2 hours, I go through the five senses and I figure which is the main one I could use, and can I find a second or a third one, right? Like Bonnie, in your story on the MRC, right? Not going to be much smell, unless, there's probably not going to be much taste. So, what are some of the senses you could add and the color you could add to that story?
Definitely hearing and sight. Hearing as far as maybe the tone, the different tones of the people in the room. And then
That,
sight,
yeah,
like I think
yeah,
maybe a good example in it was when the warden jumped out of her chair and threatened to throw the woman out of the
yeah,
room, like the
yeah,
visual of that.
yeah. And certainly hearing, for sure, I agree, right? If you've got a yelling match, right, then yeah, and you can't just say yelling, but there are shouts, there are catcalls, there may have been the scraping of chairs as people, leave or step
You
up,
say
Um,
you can't say yelling, but you, when you're talking about senses and what she's just described, hearing, you have to describe it through emotion. So you would describe the rage and the anger, and you use words like barking,
yeah,
screeching.
yeah,
Those
yeah,
words can that emotion, that senses of hearing and fear, and your heart palpitating. Those kind of adjectives work there.
yeah. Remember Dan brought us into the hospital room where the man was basically, watching and seeing his wife die. Dan, what kind of senses could you have uh, brought to the fore?
Oh, any number. I mean, if but it would rely on assumption. If I wanted to describe the lingering formaldehyde smell of the OR and
Yeah.
stuff, I don't know if that was part of the husband's mindset though.
But if you
Um,
go in thinking of the five senses, it's one of the things you ask them, right? Instead of just saying, obviously you want to get the five W's. When are you going to sue? When did you and your wife get married? But you could say, I know this is hard and I know this is painful. And we'll talk about this next week when we look at interviews. But you could ask him, you know, what do you remember hearing when you walked into the room? Or what do you
mhm,
remember, seeing? And then if you put those words, you say seeing, you'll say, I remember her fist clenched, I remembered the flowers that were now dead that I had brought her through, so ask a 5 sense question, he'll answer. And so, what do you remember
mhm,
seeing? What do you remember smelling? Right.
mhm.
Um, you know, um, in the Cooper story, right? The talisman, right? We definitely got the touch, right? We got a description of the cold, right? Um, so that helped. Natalia, how you did the river story, and remember, we in Natalia's river story, we never saw or heard the river, so we had none of the five senses. We just had
Yeah, I think,
documents.
yeah, taking into consideration all these five senses, I'm thinking about sight, like to describe, first of all, what
Yep.
is going, how it looks like, and maybe hearing also, like
Hearing
what
for sure. A river,
gesture, because we are
absolutely.
talking about fish, environment, habitants
Yep.
are in the. Mhm.
Yep. If you think of it, most of us hear a river before you see it, right? So hearing is a big part of the story. Joel, in your record story, now
Don't
again,
hear it,
so
Julian. You don't hear it in that story. What's the first thing you smell? What's your first sense? It's smell. It's like driving into Cornwall. So there's
yeah,
been a toxic dump into a river. You're going to
yep,
smell it before you hear the river.
yep,
So something
I
like
agree.
his nose
Yep,
torted
yep, that's right.
at the
And
thrust of
then
the
yep, yep, smell is great, especially on an environmental story. Joel,
Yeah,
how
could be.
let's look at harder. Joel's going into a record store, right? So again, you really want to, and we have a great character, so we get a lot from him, but what kind of senses could Joel bring to the record store owner?
I guess hearing the music in the record store.
Well, not only hearing the music, but what's your story about? It's about vinyl,
About how,
right?
or
Well,
about
but
how,
like, so I listen to music all the time on Spotify and in my earbuds, right? When was the last time I heard that wonderful sound, right?
right,
Of the needle, the bar moving across, dropping on the
skipping,
groove, that scratch, right?
skipping.
That, it's the one thing that vinyl is different. And then of course the sound might be better, but it's the sound of the needle on the wax, right?
Right.
That's, walking into that story, you need a hearing, and especially it's a story about records. So it's gonna be about hearing, you know.
Right.
But then also touch, right? Because you cannot touch Spotify. You cannot touch a playlist, right? In the old days, you could touch CDs, but he can touch those record albums, right? So you want the touch. So again, Joel is in a cab or an Uber or whatever. He's heading out. He knows he's going to do a character on a journey. He has to think, what was the first time he played a vinyl record? You think of all these things, but you're also thinking, okay, I'm in a record store. I'm not at a polluted river, or a stormy council meeting. How do I get some of the five senses? Yep, yep. Anybody else want to look at their story? Oh, sorry. India isn't here. Um, she, remember, she had a story about the dominatrix. Um, so she hinted at it. She talked about silk robe and then hug later and cups of mint tea, right? Um, and then she takes us into her BDSM workshop. A lot of good quotes, but not a lot of five senses. What are some senses? If you were editing her story, this was done for the Concordia link. What are some senses you would ask for in her story about, um, you know, uh, is sex work art? Some examples. Put on your editor's hat if some of you were editors. What would you ask for? Let's go. There are only five senses. Um,
I thought
Yes.
she had a lot of it in.
Sen
What do you
yeah.
think
So
she's?
Bonnie, yeah, Bonnie,
I guess sensuality. You could work in like the
absolutely.
sense of sensuality would be key there.
That's right. That's so definitely because we're talking about sex and sex work, and she's talking about art here. She's not talking about the financing or well, there's some, about the legality. So you want maybe, the feel and the smell of the leather,
You
right?
didn't feel that she did that when she described the atmosphere in the room and the tea and the
No, it was there. That's what we said. Her lead was great. Her lead didn't say, didn't talk about S&M. It said dungeon, hug, cups of mint tea. That's great. And even cups of mint tea, you don't have to describe its smell. I know what mint tea sells. That's good. I'm just saying there could have been so much more description, the feel of the leather, right? The aroma of some of her lotions, not to mention the site. There's not a lot of description. It's Avery talking about her journey, but after that lead, I kind of lose the great descriptions, right? And again, imagine if you were, I guess a good way to think about this, imagine you had a camera, and these days most of you do have cell phones, and you could probably do a little video to illustrate your story. But if you were a cameraman for CTV and you were going to do a story on Avery, would you just point the camera at her presumably beautiful face as she describes her S&M thing? No, you would pan most of the time and show me all her stuff. Well, that's what you have to do as a journalist. You're obviously looking at her eyes, you're getting the quotes, but in your article, if you look at India's article, most of it is coming out of Avery's mouth, which is fine. But I don't care about her mouth. I want to know what's around her, what she's dressed at, what's on her shelves, what are some of her favorite mementos. Again, make a checklist of the five senses and say, well, I can't get taste, but I could do touch, right? I'm trying to see if there's any other examples. It's surprising if you actually put your mind to it, how easy it is to come up with the five senses if you just, um, think about it. Denise's Bonnie and Tashi's story, it's a story about music. And just like in Natalia's story, where we never meet the river, uh, Tashi has a whole story about this conductor and music teacher, and I never hear the music. She could be a math teacher for all I would know in that story, right? I never hear i.e., the music she loves, why she loves Bach, why she'll miss Beethoven, um, the joy of hearing a kid struggle over violin. It doesn't have to be just beautiful stuff, right? But I never really hear that music. Just looking for one of my sheets or notes. Okay, good. I hope this is helpful for you guys. And again, what I'm trying to do here, your writing is already good. You're doing good research. You're getting good stories. These are just little tricks, little tools that would, allow you to, once you've written the story, even, it's just stepping back and say, okay, I could tweak that. I could change that, right? So you know it. Just going to grab a paper that's filled. Okay. Um, yeah. Okay. Hospital. Good. All right. Turns. Even in a 5 or 6 graph story, Dan's story, if you recall, I think, what is it, Dan? It's what, 10 graphs, maybe, the lawsuit may, at most. Um, it wasn't very
Yeah,
long,
something.
Yeah, it's really, and Chelsea, these were both news stories, right? Mansou's Hospital, Chelsea story, the real estate fraud, I think it was, 7, 8 graphs. Fairly linear, but at some point there still has to be a turn, right? You're going from the hospital room to why he's doing the lawsuit. You're going from Chad to the phone call that the journalist makes to find out about the fraudulent seller and mortgage broker, right? And obviously, in a complicated story like Bonnie's, where there are at least 15 turns, right? So and so said this, then this person said this, right? You really have to signal. And in Natalia's story, where you basically have two warring sides, right? The environmentalist and the CNL, you're still going back and forth. After you start at the beginning, right? They're worried, da, da, da. Then the rest of it is they say this, but there's this, right? So in once you're past 6 or 8 graphs, you are into turns, and you could, if you don't do your turns correctly, not only will you get a ticket, although I like to say in Quebec, turn signals are optional on most cars, because people just use their horn. But I always call it um, meant like the ESP rider. I've got a driver in front of me, and I say, "Oh, right, you're projecting your thoughts to me, so you don't have to signal, right? I was supposed to know as you started leaning towards the right." Well, a reader does not have time to figure out where you're going. So, one, if they're confused, they'll stop reading the story, or they'll read it and they'll get confused. But more importantly, if you're just riding down a highway and just making one boring turn after another, then this, your passenger is going to go to sleep, right? You have to make the journey exciting. So you need to use the turns to crank up the tension every time, right? Obviously, just with something as simple as but there's got to be better ways. So transitions are important. I like to think about it as hello, goodbye. Every scene, if you're in the hospital room, you've got to say hello at the beginning, but you have to say goodbye. How are you going to leave? How is, the husband, the grieving husband, going to leave the room? I don't necessarily physically mean leaving the room. It could be his memory, but you've got to move from one scene to another. And then you've got to get into your next scene. And you could have a soft goodbye or a hard goodbye, right? Like you could lead into, or you do a hard one. And you have to think when you're structuring. Different kinds of turn signals. So a soft one is building. We'll see that in a minute. In India's sex worker story, we meet Avery, and about halfway through, we say, she's not the only one, right? Like you move on, right? Or another problem. You have changing position or place, meanwhile back at, right? Or in another school, right? Timing, of course, it all began. You could take me back. Um, in the end. And then conflict, of course, is one of the main ways to make the transition. So that would be a but, or on the other hand, or but in fact, right? Conflict is one of the main ways you'll do it. So if you look at Dan's story, right? He's in the hospital. He's not going to go to another patient, right? He could say, this is a widespread problem that experts say is common. He could do that, but that's not what his story is about. His story has to be this happened, then maybe timing, right? After 2 months, he realized something was up, then they discovered, and then conflict, but in fact, right? Natalie and Bonnie, it's all about conflict and forth. So you have to think about these. Whoop. So here's an example in India's story, right? Which is both adding but also stepping up the tension, right? While Avery considers her work as a dominatrix to be an art, other sex workers feel their work is labor done for financial survival. Perfect turn. It's not just saying it does two things. In addition, I now know I'm going to meet other workers, but it's a change. I'm going from art to money. And then I meet Blair. Perfect, perfect transition. He does two things, right? He introduces a new character, but increases the tension. If she had just said, Avery is not the only dominatrix, Blair Monroe has been doing it, has been an escort for 10 years. Okay, I'm meeting somebody else. I know where I'm going, but I'm not interested in the tension. She's jacking it up, right? So, right, that's what you need. Um, all right. In about the fifth or sixth paragraph in Natalia's story, we hear from the environmentalist. We already talked about how she would make it more five senses. And then we finally get to the other side, right? So we hear, Larissa says there's acute toxicity, poses a danger. I'm getting it. And now we get, this is the turn. In response to concerns, CNL reported that the criteria for what waste is allowed at the site has been narrowed to only low-level radioactive waste as opposed to low and intermediate level waste in the initial proposal. An Ottawa Riverkeeper report of toxic sewage reads or something, right? All right. Now we still haven't actually heard from CNL. This is a summary from the opposition. And then we goes on. CNL Media Relations told the nation in an email statement that with its very modern. So this is classic news language to give me the other side, right? Does it work? How could Natalia have made a turn that increases the tension? Natalia, why don't you?
Well, I'm thinking about transitional words. There are no transitional words.
Exactly. In response to concerns, it's a bit of a turn, it's kind of, but it's not really telling me, okay, you've heard black, now here's white, right? You're not,
That's the thing.
Julian, you do realize as an editor, I don't. The turns that we make are not the final turns in the paper because that's determined by the graphic artist, the advertising, and everything else.
no, I don't literally mean the turn go from page 1 to page 3. I'm saying the turn could be in paragraph 3,
Oh, that's
yeah. I don't mean the turn, right? The newspaper sense turn. No. I mean, a turn in your story, right? You might have a turn in the second paragraph, right? Trump said, US aid is full of corruption, but an investigation by the New York Times finds that there was no whatever. Your turn can be in your second graph. But looking at Natalia's story, one, you're not flagging in response to concerns is not language that tells me, pay attention, we are veering sharply to the right, right? So how
So
could you have phrased it different? Yeah, Dan?
if
What do you
all
think?
that info is still there, but you begin with something like um, the CNL denied culpability or denied the
That that would help for sure. At least that. Um, um, and you might want to be a little, I mean, it'd be nice if we had a human being, obviously, rather,
Yeah.
but if you don't have a name, you could say, uh, and again, rather than even saying CNL, uh, but I don't know if it's a government body or how you describe it, but you'd say, but the people in charge of the river, strongly, insist, there's nothing to
Indignantly
worry about.
denied.
Yeah, or fervently denied, or um uh, and I would, or even use this very modern, but the people in charge of river safety say they are proud of, quote, their very modern sewage plant, and they remain confident nothing will happen. Okay, now I've got Eagles versus, the Chiefs, right? Because literally, to use, a Super Bowl, that would be like, in response to tough defensive play, you know, the Chiefs were determined to play offense. Okay, but that's not a term, right?
Yeah, so in this case, I would paraphrase everything just to condense this
Or
in one
actually use
paragraph.
like this, yeah, but like, one woman, Larissa, is telling me this river is about to kill babies. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you get my sense, right? Right. And then I say criteria, like, I don't know what this is, has been narrowed to only low level. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
for fairness, you have to put that full quote in later on. But I would say, and again, rather than CNL, I don't care about CNL. For me is like stakeholders or media, right? I would say, but the people in charge of river safety, or the government officials in charge of river safety, say they are very proud of, quote, their very modern sewage plant. And they are, quote, confident, right, that there is no detrimental impact, right? Oh, sorry. Well, if you
Yeah,
use those words, yeah,
that would
modern,
be in one
confident,
paragraph and with the turn. Yeah.
absolutely. If you've got a turn, and you've given
And
me
more
the
clear,
three curse.
more simple.
That's right. You've got very modern, confident, no detrimental impact. I could
And
stop reading the story there and I get it, right? Larissa is worried your babies are going to die. The government people are saying, don't worry. And what's good about a good turn like that is then the rest of the story, you know where it's going to go, right? I'm going to hear back and forth, right? So again, this is okay for a first draft. That's definitely the way I'd write it. Right? Then you take a breath, go for a coffee, come back and say, I could make a much sharper turn, right? And if you look, I've been in a writing room for one of my books. I knew an ex-FBI agent, so he invited me in Hollywood to the writers' room for Criminal Intent. If those of you know how, when you sit back and you watch White Lotus or whatever you're watching on streaming these days, but in the writing room, the writers are sitting there and they have the story plotted out on a whiteboard with the various scenes, and they're constantly looking. Right, but where does he find the gun? Second commercial? No, no. It's much better if we put it in the third commercial, right? And they're always plotting out the turns, right? Where do we make that, the whodunit turn? Now, sometimes they may only have a week to write an episode, right? You might have a few hours, but everything I'm trying to teach you, it's even more important. I might have 6 months to a year to write a book, right? But back in the day, I had 5, 6 hours to tell my story for CBC News Watch. So all these things I'm telling you are even more important when you don't have the time, because you've got to think quickly on your feet. All right, turns. I think um, MRCC. Yeah, we did the toxic. Yeah. Uh, oh, in sorry, in let me see if I have it here. No. Yeah, here. Now, remember, Bonnie had a much tougher story, right? Natalia had two sides: environmentalist Larissa, CNL. I haven't counted the number of characters in the story, but if I look at the names quickly, Bonnie, you must name at least, looks like 8, 9, 10 people, right? That's a You have to, like, in most theaters, they'd give you a playlist of the characters, right? So I'm not saying you can't, this is a city, and also a lot of your readers know these people, but if you have 8 or 9 people, I'm not even sure who's on what side. You really have to plot your turns, right? More carefully, right? Like here, several citizens spoke predominantly asking, I don't know what side they're on, right? Like, are they supporting what we just heard, right? I need to, but anger grew as then I know what side they're on, right? Um, Equities publisher asked why I couldn't invest. Again, I assume that he's angry, but I don't quite know. Mayor asked if all informations would be cited in the newsletter. Again, perfectly straight writing, that's fine, but you're not making a turn here. Is that continuing, or are we going back? Is what she's saying supportive of what we just heard from Dixon? Um, you know, and then several mayors proceeded to comment. Okay, but again, that's not a turn. That's just saying this happened next. I need to know, are we wrapping up, right? To calm things down. Several mayors tried to, maybe that's where you go. I don't know, right? But you've got to, you know, um, yeah, look at each one, I literally don't know if these are the yellow jerseys or the blue jerseys, right? Or if there are 3 teams. I don't know. You've really got to look at your turns. Okay. Let's wrap, and we'll have time for some questions as well, on organizing your writing. And again, this is the thinking I would do when I was back in the day when I was at CBC. We were in a van. So we'd go out in the morning at 10 o'clock to interview people. And on the way back, we'd start screening the interview on the little machines, and I'd start writing on the back of my notepad or sometimes on the back of the cassette box. So you have to try to organize your writing, keeping in mind what we've already discussed: beginning, middle, and end, climax, character, context, conflict, climax, and conclusion. Couple of things to think about, especially when you're writing features. Not a one-day news story, although to some degree it works, but certainly if you're doing a 2-3 day feature, and if you have longer, you're writing a longer feature, like Marie's story on the pregnancy clinic. I heard a great interview with a writer once, who said there are 2 kinds of writers. There are gardeners and there are architects. So a gardener plants the seeds and you never quite know how the characters and plot will develop. Architects, and I think most of us are architects because we're in the news business and we're also in the rush business, right? You don't have time to plant the seed and watch it grow. You got to get the story to barrel by 2 o'clock, right? So most of us tend to be architects. And the difference is that if you're planting something, you kind of know you're planting carrots, but you're not quite sure how they're going to turn out and what else is going to come up. An architect, you make pretty detailed plans, but you might move the window on the 3rd floor, but you're not going to go from the 3rd floor to an RV, right? Now, like you, I tend to be an architect, but what I've discovered is even though I plan, when Dan headed out, he knew he was going to interview the husband and maybe the lawyer, right? He wasn't going to interview 4 medical experts on anesthesiology, right? So he had a bit of a scaffolding. But there has to be a bit of gardening because he doesn't quite know what the husband's going to say, right? Is the husband angry or is he kind of resigned? If he goes the 5 senses, right? Is he going to give him a sense of the sound of the beeping that just crystallizes the story, right? You never quite know what you're going to get, right? Bonnie knows she's going to a tempestuous council meeting, but there, especially, she has no idea how is it going to end, right? Is the mayor going to resign? Is somebody going to use a swear word? So for all the scaffolding, leave some room for your own WTF moment where you go, wow, I didn't expect that. So now I'm going to write it that way. I can give you one example. When I wrote my Lincoln book on Montreal and the Civil War, it's like 450 pages. I had about a year, if not a bit longer, to work on it. Obviously, it was heavily scaffolding. I needed to know, I had about five or six, if not 10 main characters. So I had charts. I had to know when somebody was going to die, when somebody was going to meet Lincoln, when I was going to reveal somebody was lying. All that was scaffolding out. But as I was writing it, I figured it would be pretty traditional, that the good guys, the people on the Union side, would be my main characters, and obviously the bad guys would be the Confederate spies in Montreal. But as I was writing, I figured I'd end with the victory and the good guys win, they and the bad guys were much more interesting. So my good guys, I found great twists because I found some dark secrets of their own. But I realized it was the bad guys who actually learned the most and turned defeat into victory. So I rewrote it and ended with them and their victory. So that was an example where I did some scaffolding, but a lot of it was gardening. So keep in mind, just keep this in mind as you're out there. Try to be a bit of a gardener, which leads me to my next point. Even if you're assigned a story at 10 and you have to file by 2, certainly if you're assigned a story by Monday and you have to file by Wednesday, you've got 2 days, 3 days, like Joel did, or Natalia. And especially if you've got a week or two, or you're doing a story on the side, right? Right. So Beryl is assigned a daily story, but in the meantime, you're preparing a feature on senior homes and elevators, so you've got 2, 3 weeks to work on it. Start writing right away. I mean, not just planning, literally, you know, by the time I've done my first day of research and say I've been assigned a story on Monday, I've got to write it by Thursday. Um, uh, when I promise the Globe or the Star I'm going to do an op-ed, they say, can you get it to me by Friday? So I've got to do some research, but I start writing the first day, right? Don't wait for all your research, all your
Said
interviews
that,
to be over.
Julian. I'm so glad you said that, because every time I assign a long-term story or a research piece, that's one of the things I say. Get your notes down as soon as you get them and start building. And
And
usually
start
they do.
building. Exactly. Now it's obviously going to change as you garden and you find this great scene you hadn't imagined. But you want to start writing right away, not because you want to save time, because on Friday, you want to go play tennis and not be caught in writing.
Who does
It's
that?
Who does that, right? Who does that? What It's because instead of just being the investigative, you've got to be a writer. What amazes me, if you think about it, clearly, keep a diary next time you do a story. You probably spent 90% of your time uh, researching a story, right? Interviewing, right? Dan, Natalia, I'm sure spent 90% of your time interviewing, getting the documents, and 10% of your time being the storyteller, right? And on a daily story, you get the assignment at 10, you're out there till 2, right? You write it by 3, maybe by 4, right? Um, what I'm suggesting, instead of reporting and then writing, you let your writing help guide your reporting. That's what's so important, because your writing will, you'll discover the holes. I'll give you an example. When I was writing my book on Stephen Truscott, one of Canada's most famous wrongful convictions, a boy in the 1950s, I had already done a documentary. I'd spent 2 years telling the documentary. I figure, how hard could it be to write the book, right? I've got all the documents. Well, it took me a year. And so a good example was, I knew that Stephen had met the girl. He was 14, she was 13, had met the girl he was accused of killing on Tuesday, June 9th, a hot night, 1959, at a party Friday. That was a great fact, a great scene. Clearly, these two young kids were dancing, and she was going to die 4 days later, and he would be an accused murderer and sentenced to hang. So that's my story. As I start writing, 4 days before the fateful encounter. That's not how I wrote it, obviously, but the two of them, were at a sock hop at the gym, something like that. Okay, not bad. But obviously, what did I need to know? I needed to know what were they listening, what record was playing, right? What music, how were they dressed? So the minute I wrote that, I suddenly realized, and I went back and looked at the hit charts, and suddenly I had a scene because I knew what music they were listening to, right? When he got sentenced or he was walking, when he was walking in, I checked to see what movies were playing at the movie theater across the street. And it was like Hang 'em High or some great Western, right? So the sooner you start writing, the sooner you realize I need to know this, right? Dan needed to know what was the last vision the husband had of his dead wife before she died, right? What was the last time? Was it a kiss on the forehead, a little wave? You need to know that as you're writing, so you realize.
And this isn't
Okay?
just for color commentary, by the way.
Absolutely,
When
you're
I
right.
was in
Yeah,
criminal law, so many cases were turned on those little details. What do you
totally,
mean he was there at such a night seeing, to use your example, that movie? That movie's finished playing 3 days before.
exactly.
Everything
So you,
was
you're. By the way, I just noticed a little thing there, double spelling mistake, so embarrassing. So you you
don't
know
tell
you need to start writing right away because it'll influence your your
me.
your research. Finally, you've done all of this. You've turned into amazing writers. Hemingway is jealous. He used to work for the Toronto papers. Um, and you followed everything else we talked about, structure, focus, character on a journey. When you sit back, and especially again, if you have only one day, you got the assignment at 10, you're back at the office at 2, you finish writing at 3, take 5 minutes to go back over your story and cut 30% of it if you can, right? Certainly all the adjectives, you know, um, all the varies and especially and stuff like that. But less is always more. Um, I mean, it's great. Obviously, you guys are, as last time I wrote an op-ed, like an op-ed for the Globe has to be, Natasha usually asks for 600 to 700 words. It's really hard to push more than 700. Almost always my first draft will be about 900 because I'm not quite sure, and then that's pretty good. If I have to cut 200 words, it's like cutting off your left arm. But that's pretty good, right? Uh, my first draft of, well, more than first, but it was pretty much the polished version of North Star. We had to cut 100 pages, right? The book, if we had published what I had, and it was good, this was, it was 600 pages. We had to cut it back to 450, not counting, right? So I had to take 100 great pages, great scenes, all right? They were just as good as the scenes we kept in, right? Less is more. Even if it means, if Barrel's giving you 200 words or 6 graphs and Dan has 6 graphs, maybe you can cut one of them and then expand, get a bit of sense, right? Because you got to add some of the 5 senses, right? So do I really need it, right?
Well,
Really,
we do
really, really need it.
300.
Yeah, sweet. But whatever. I mean, go back and cut, right? Everybody thinks they're Shakespeare, that their words are magic. Trust me, they're not. And when we went back and read some of your stories, there was clearly a lot of blah blah, right? We don't need blah blah. Uh, and after you finished, um, it's a good idea if you can to read your story out loud or at least read it to yourself. You don't have to open your mouth, but if you actually read a story, because remember, I don't want to, keep picking on Natalia because the story was good. But let me just try to find it. Uh, we had it somewhere up here. Oh, if in your mind, if Natalia's written her story and then she writes to herself, according to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, CNSCC, Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, CNL, was granted a license to construct a near surface disposable facility. I can't even read that. NSDF at the Chalk River site on May 16 with the purpose to dispose radioactive waste and, quote, isolate it from people and the environment. If anybody sits back and reads that paragraph, right, you would realize I have trouble reading it, much less saying it out loud, right? I have got to make it simpler. One of the hardest, but in the end quite enjoyable, I did the audiobook of my Lincoln book. I listen to audiobooks all the time. I don't know about you. I read, but I constantly am listening to audiobooks. So I didn't realize it takes like 2 to 3 weeks to read, like even professional readers, right, to read. But I had to read my own writing out loud with headphones in a studio with a director who would say, let's increase the tension here, Julian, or you're emphasizing the wrong word. Nothing is more embarrassing. I would dare you at the end of the day to stand outside, on St. Catherine Street in Montreal or somewhere in Pontiac with a microphone and read your stories out loud. It is embarrassing, right? Because we look at it in print and, because my brain, if you look at my eyes, I don't have to read all of this. I kind of know, right. Nuclear body, but nuclear labs. I'm not really reading every syllable. But when you say it out loud, you have to read literally Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, open brackets, CNL, close brackets read your story out loud and you will be shocked at how it does not work. It does not flow off the tongue. And if it doesn't flow off the tongue, it's because you're not writing it well. All right, I'm going to zip back down to summarize.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm thinking, that it's supposed to be, yeah, paraphrased by more simple words,
Absolutely.
like telling to a friend a story.
That's what we said last week, right? What's your
Yeah.
focus? So if you have to think at the end when you're writing a story, if you've got a 5-year-old daughter or 5-year-old niece and they say, Mommy or Auntie Natalia, what'd you work on today? You would never say, well, the CNSCC is concerned
Yeah.
that the CNNL is engaging in effluent sewage. Like, even if you told that to a physics professor, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, right? So definitely, how would you tell the story to a
Yeah,
5-year-old?
to explain. Yeah.
Totally,
Okay.
totally. You know, and if you look at some of the best writing, look at a good example is look at I forget, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Ivan Semenchuk. He's the science writer for the Globe and Mail. Or look at Andre Picard, who writes health columns for the Globe. So Ivan's science stories are things that are incomprehensible to me, right? Black holes, or he's got things about quarks, and like I have no idea, like the words make no sense to me, but he writes in plain English that I understand what the story is about, even though I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what these things are, right? So Bonnie has an easier challenge because everybody knows what a budget is. Everybody knows what a town council is, right? Dan's writing about a woman. Everybody's been to the hospital. Everybody knows somebody who's died. Natalia's writing about a river. So you're not talking about nuclear fission here. You're talking about records, music teachers. But because we're journalists, you have an amazing ability to complicate things with stakeholder language, bad terms, right? 5 Ws, right? You think and again, think about it. No human being in the world talks the way we write. Does not exist. Just simply, we write in a language that is is completely foreign to the way human beings talk, right? So stop doing it. All right. So just to recap, build scenes, not paragraphs. Take the reader on a journey. Your lead should be a flashlight, a promise. Show, don't tell. Small, eye-catching details. Look for the linoleum floor. Write for all five senses, or at least two. I'd settle for one. But if you actually look at your stories, I would say most of your stories really don't even have one sense. I mean, I guess you have hearing because I hear the quotes, but not really because those are just words. Turn signals, right? Use turn signals to increase the tension. Organize your writing, be ready to be a gardener. Less is more. And finally, when you're done, read what you've written out loud for cadence and rhythm. Okay, that was pretty good, actually. So, first, last week we did characters on a journey. We looked at structure and focus. Today we did writing, building scenes, show, don't tell. Next week, for those of you who could hang around, normally we would have done this, as the second stage, is doing interviews. I'm going to mainly, obviously, I have to use TV interviews because I have no examples of your interviews, but we'll talk about your interviews. The husband who lost his wife, the record store owner, the environmentalist, Larissa. So bring examples of difficult interviews you have. Um, I'll mainly use examples of politicians, a lot of Trump, some Obama, some Trudeau, and I'm going to use people like that, not because although in many cases because you're writing for community papers, unlike the most Gazette reporters will never get to speak to the premier or a top person, but most of you will get to speak to your mayor, top city council people, top businessmen. So you actually do interview people in power. And my theory of interviews, and we'll talk about it next week, we'll have a lot of fun because the interviews are really fun to see, and you'll see how whether, and I'm agnostic as a journalist, so whether it's Trump or Trudeau, Obama, or I have an example of Pierre Trudeau, I don't care about their politics. All politicians, and more importantly, all people lie. What I mean, I have Dr. House's rule, right? If you remember that, the TV show All People Lie, is that obviously politicians lie, or the owner of a company that's polluting the river might lie, but the husband of the dying wife might, quote, lie because even he doesn't know the full truth of his story, right? Because he's still so shell shocked. He's hiding, not out of maliciousness. He's just hidden it deep inside. And you have to figure out a way to trigger him so that he tells the story that he's been keeping up, even from himself. So that's the challenge in interviews, right?
Okay.
How do you crack that person? Okay, so look, we've got a couple of minutes left. Again, all this is on my website, julianshare.com. You can obviously email me with some of your latest stories if you want any comments. And do try to come back next week for interviews. Ilka, we still have a few minutes for just
Yeah.
general questions, right? Okay, we've got
Yeah, we
about,
do.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that on your website, it's a bit hard to find the training. So I just put the link julianshare.com/training.
Okay.
Um,
Wait a minute.
because I
Hold
couldn't
on.
link through to your trainings through your website.
Okay,
See
wait
on
a
the
minute.
top there on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
right
hold
where
on.
it says
Well,
training.
I've got to get rid here at full screen. Okay, let me go back. I hope it's a little clearer. Okay, so you type in my name, but in this case,
Yeah.
just julianshare.com. You go there, you get to this website, and here it says training. So it's
So,
like books, then you go to training, and then depending what you're
I
interested.
was
So in
trying
this
to click
case,
through on the top where your name is and like
oh, I
in the
see.
lighter shade of
Oh,
gray.
I see.
I
I
thought there
see.
would be a
No, no,
link
no, no.
there.
Yeah, one thing
So,
I always
okay.
tell my wife when she comes to a website is yes, but I always explore a bit, right? So, so yes, you click here, it's not going to work, but there it's training. You can
Oh
watch
yeah,
some of my
perfect.
interviews, read my
Perfect.
books. Yeah, you go there and then scroll. So in this case, today's thing is right here, right? So you just click on
Yeah,
that. You
great.
could download the PDF. But there's other stuff, right? Storytelling, writing, other stuff to look at.
Um,
Okay.
Hey,
Yeah.
C from the Equity just emailed me and asked if there would be a video from today that I know
Yeah, so I
you
think
were
I
offering
I
to
have
download.
recorded this. Yeah, so I
Yeah,
think this one went better. So I only record a couple of times, so I'm pretty sure when I end the slideshow, Google Zoom says, how do you want to save the video?
yeah,
It's quite intensive. It's a heavy file,
right.
but what I'll do is I'll at a minimum, I'll send it to you by WeTransfer, but I'll put it on my
Okay,
webpage. Okay. So what I'll do,
perfect.
folks, well, we already closed it, but what I'll try to do is right here under writing for newspapers, I'll put watch video and you can watch
Perfect.
it there. There is some video here. Um,
Okay.
so you could actually watch some of this, uh, including one in French. Actually, what I'll do is I'll add it here in the video section. Okay.
Videos section. Okay.
Yeah, it'll be
And
right there.
I'll let Chelsea know as well because I feel like
Yes,
she would have
that's
wanted
right.
to be here today.
Chelsea, you did great writing, and our condolences on your grandmother. I hope Chelsea's here next week. Okay. Other questions?
Great.
We've still got about 6 or 7 minutes. Really feel free to ask. It could be about writing, but it could be about anything.
So I do have a question,
Yeah.
which might already have gotten answered, but you were talking about how you hate seeing initials, and I have a bad habit that I see other print journalists do. For example, in a crime story, they'll write out Service de Police de Ville-Montréal and then in brackets SPVM, and
Yeah.
then throughout the rest of the article, just write SPVM. Is
Yeah.
there anything wrong with simply writing Montreal Police?
I totally agree with you. I mean, again, I try to keep again, have you ever met anybody in a bar or at your family home on the weekend who either says SPVM? Like people do
No.
say MUC. There are certain terms we use, right? People say MUC. Some people do, right? There are certain terms you use, but nobody ever uses SPVM, much less, and even Francophone, nobody says Service de Police de nobody. They say the cops. They say police. They might say homicide, right? Nobody uses initials, right? Nobody. So I agree. Keep it, that's why I'm saying read your stories out loud. Keep it conversational, you know?
Mhm.
Absolutely, you know? But the other thing is title, like if they say, I hate it when they say Minister of Resources and Natural Development, Francois Champagne, right? Like again, if somebody walked in to your house, you'd never say, "Oh, here's the Minister of Development and Agricultural Rezoning," Frank. You'd say, "Here's Frank. He's in charge of agriculture." Like you'd explain it in a and then you can give the title later. Yeah.
Unless it's germane to the story, like for example, the newest the candidate for the leadership of Ensemble Montréal, Sorat Farada. I mean, she wants to be mayor of a major city, but it's also true that she spent time as
Yeah,
tourism
that worked.
and
That's right. But
economic
I think I
development
remember
officer.
reading the story actually. I think it said the tourism minister, like it described her like she was a halfback, right? It didn't say the minister, whatever her official title was, right? It didn't say, it said somebody
Yes,
who was
right.
federal tourism minister is not capital T and capital M, right? It's like saying,
Okay.
a relief pitcher for, the San Diego Padres. It's not
There's a way.
capital.
There's a way to handle it, which I do in the editing. That
Hmm.
our ministerial titles have gotten so unwieldy and so
Totally.
ridiculous
Yes.
Yeah.
that you just say the first thing, the most relevant thing,
Yeah,
agriculture, tourism minister, blah blah, whatever her name
that's
is.
right. And again, agriculture, I always say, if it try to avoid capitalizing. So, the agriculture minister, again,
I,
is like
I
saying the
like
relief pitcher. You don't have
I
to
like
say
that.
the minister, just keep it simple.
I like capital,
Absolutely.
Julian. I
Yeah.
like capital.
Well, the reason I don't like capital letters is again, nobody speaks in capital letters. I've never been
Yes,
at a dinner party where somebody says capital letter. It just doesn't
let's
exist. I mean, I'm
It should be
joking a bit.
less.
Obviously, sometimes you have to, President Trump, P is capitalized, Prime Minister,
Delay on your hearing. You know that?
pardon me?
You don't got a slight delay in your earphones in your hearing.
Oh, could
Uh,
be. It may
very,
be. It's
and
my
I noticed
age,
the first time,
probably.
but no,
Okay,
it's not your
any other
age. Just
question? More questions? Good. That was a good question, Dan. Other
Julian's
questions?
point, and to Julian's point, how to handle all this. For example, we never say the full title of the agglomeration council. We say the
Yeah,
agglo.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially a
I'd
lot
want
of
to
you are writing for your own audiences, so you have, common words that you don't have to expand on because everybody in Pontiac knows what you're talking about. Bonnie, you had a question?
Yeah, I kind of want to jump in a little bit more on Natalia's article because we're covering that story as well. So I'm super familiar with the whole thing and all the initials and all that. And so kind of wondering about that because I get it. Like we're writing it the same way she is, where we're putting out the full Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, CNL in everything. So I'm just wondering about the importance of identifying them. So if I'm understanding correctly, so we could say, the nuclear laboratory said or responded or whatever, and the nuclear regulator, as opposed to giving the whole thing. But is it still important to give the whole title and
For
initials
sure.
at some place in the
No, for
article?
sure. No, you've got to get, it's like, if somebody's full name is, Marie-Françoise Champagne, Harvey, at some point you've got to give the person's full name, right? Just certainly don't clutter up your lead. Try not to clutter up your nut graph, right? So if you say, environmentalists are worried about, the toxicity of the river, but you can, even if you have to say the government body in charge is not, even that is a bit better. I would try to say the people in charge, figure out a nicer way. Maybe then the second time you say the federal laboratory says its tests are fine. And then you say the CNSSLLL, I mean, I love Quebec, right? You go in any, like, you're driving on the highway and the signs are for the CSSSSMMM. I mean, God, in Quebec, the initials are mind-boggling.
Yeah,
So,
I
yes,
absolutely agree. Yeah, Juliet. Because, yeah, to simplify more and to make it better for a reader to think
that's right.
about the reader,
That's right.
we have to
That's right.
make to use
Make
some other words. Absolutely
use some
agree.
other words, and then at one point give the full title, and then like there are some words that really help. No one calls it the Conseil de Syndicats Nationaux. Everybody calls it CSN. So there are some words that you are easy to understand, right? And nobody calls it CUSMA. It's still called NAFTA, but there are there are some words that are much easier. So use the initials if that helps you, for sure.
And
You
anyways,
know.
Bonnie, thank you very much for mentioning this because really, this is like kind of challenge. We have to name the
Absolutely.
institution.
Yeah,
However, to find some other ways as well. So yeah, it's a good
that's
point,
right.
Bonnie.
That's right. Also, I like if there are other words you could do, right? Leader, chief, head, right? You don't always have to give the person's full title, right? So you'll often say party leader, right? Or the whatever, the city councilor in charge of environment, right? You use again natural storytelling words that explain your story. All right. I hope this was helpful. I think we had a good session. You guys were great as always.
Was
So
great.
Yeah.
okay,
Thank you.
I will see you next week where we'll have a little more fun next week because we won't embarrass you with your interviews since I don't have examples of that. So we'll look at embarrassing mistakes by pretty famous journalists, and we'll marvel at how smart. There's a Polyev video I'll show you if you haven't already seen it, the famous Apple interview. It's really clever to see how the people we're interviewing are much smarter than we are. And unlike you, they have taken classes in how to do interviews and how to
Mm.
not answer your question. So we'll look at the tricks they use and how you could counter some of their tricks. All right. Have fun.
Great.
Enjoy the snow.
Thank you
I'm
so
going
much.
Thanks
skiing.
It
again,
was
Julian.
interesting, helpful. Thank
Care,
you.
pal.
Thanks everyone
Thanks,
for showing
everyone.
up.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take
Okay.
care.
Bye.
Bye bye.